me just read you this one passage from the Dead Sea Scrolls, not Worm's translation, but my translation.
Oh, I just got that yesterday.
Which? This one here? Yeah, this is really good stuff. Of the Damascus document, which I think is a very good translation, obviously. This is addressed, by the way, to the knowers of righteousness, and that God has a dispute with all flesh and will do justice, will do righteousness. And they had a covenant with the first, and he left a remnant in Ezekiel. Did not deliver them up to be destroyed at the time of the first wrath, then when the king of Nebuchadnezzar came, and so on, the first destruction of the first temple. And then in line 7, he visited them, as I told you last time, a visit. Who visited them? God visited them. Well, if God visited them, it's very much like the Gospels portray God visiting Mary, but I don't think God visited Mary to have a Greco-Roman sort of romance festival and procreate a child. Not in this document anyway. That's more like what we see in Greek mythology. Zeus is always running around with human maidens and from getting demigods and titans and all these kinds of individuals. No, God visited them and caused a root of planting to grow. And it's singular for all those who think there's a dual Messiah at Qumran. It's singular. To grow from Israel and from Aaron, a single thing. To inherit his land and prosper on the good things of his earth. And they understood their sinfulness, and they knew that they were sinners. That is, remission of sins. They were called upon to make atonement for sin. They understood they were sinners. And they were like blind men groping for the way for 20 years, and God considered their works righteousness, not faith. And because they sought him with a whole heart, watch the heart imagery, and he raised them up for them a teacher of righteousness to guide them in the way of his heart. And what the teacher of righteousness does is guide the community in the way of God's heart. And he made known to the last generations, our time, the present time, the time this is written in, which they consider to be the last times, what he would do in the last generation. But notice that the teacher of righteousness guides them in the way of God's heart. Okay? Now, we've read that, all right? Now, in chapter 15, as you recall, of Matthew, chapter 7 of Mark, in fact, is a little more extensive in this particular instance. Usually Mark is more compressed. But in this instance, Mark is more prolix. It's not paralleled in John or Luke. So you see, you really can't tell the relationship of the Gospels where a thing is going to pop up in Luke, Mark, or Matthew, and when Mark is going to be more extensive, but when the other is going to be less, and so on. But this starts off, and I'll repeat it. They came to Jesus from Jerusalem, Pharisees and scribes, says Matthew, and says Mark there, and there gathered unto him Pharisees and some or certain of the scribes which had come from Jerusalem. This is an epitome or a reflection or a retrospective projection backwards of the some from Jerusalem coming down to question Paul and Cephas and Barnabas about table fellowship with Gentiles. That is what I submit to you. You don't have to believe me, is going on here. And we discussed it last time why I think that. But notice how we have the emphasis on the person here writing this material is my view, a person from Hellenistic background, a follower of Paul, and someone who's using historical episodes to write his version or her version or his theological approach into the teaching of the master teacher, Jesus, whose name means salvation itself. Jesus in Hebrew meaning salvation. This is my approach. It doesn't mean you have to accept this. Look, we know the normative approach. You say, well, this is my approach. It's the normative approach, yes, that we believe exactly what's written here. I understand that. We don't have to keep beating that horse. Everyone knows that particular position. We've heard it for 2,000 years. I mean, we're going to keep hearing it for 2,500 years without hearing anything that might say something slightly different. We know don't say we don't know the Orthodox approach. If anyone doesn't know the Orthodox approach, read the book. So we don't need to say, well, you know, I don't agree with that. Okay, I understand. I'm not saying you should. I want to throw out a challenge to you to think and consider what is actually going on, and that's why this has been so difficult to penetrate. You know, you say, why haven't people previously penetrated? I told you one of the reasons is they didn't have the Dead Sea Scrolls. You know, to give them the material, they didn't have the Dead Sea Scrolls to show them what a Palestinian, authentic Palestinian, messianic, apocalyptic, militant movement would look like. So how would they know what something different might look like? How could they penetrate this? But you see, now we have had, for the last 50 years, the Dead Sea Scrolls. And in my view, for the last 25, we're getting some decent evaluations of the scrolls, in-depth, literary, not just considering the handwriting or some, you know, superficial, external way of approaching the materials, but looking at what the scrolls actually say, we're getting some, you know, in-depth understanding of what the scrolls are about. I read you that passage from the scrolls to begin with on purpose. So, let's see. So, let me get this over here if I can. I guess I'm going to move this thing because I have it pointed a little bit in the wrong direction. There we go. Something over here, so I have it put in the wrong place. In any event, so let's just, because it's easier to spread these things out here. So, according to, remember, the sum from James come down, and in Mark we actually have the sum. Now I told you that Pharisees often and scribes from Jerusalem are not always Pharisees and scribes from Jerusalem in the historical sense. They sometimes reflect the Jerusalem church, who are looked upon as Pharisees. Acts says, in the introduction to the Jerusalem Council, Acts 15, it says, some Pharisees came down to Antioch and taught the brothers that unless you were circumcised, you could not be saved. And that triggered Paul going up to Jerusalem to put his version of the good news before the so-called Jerusalem Council. And James, the brother of Jesus, the leader of the early churches, appears for the first time authentically there without any introduction. So we've already heard in Galatians 2 that the party of the circumcision is James. So the some insisting on circumcision who come down to Antioch